Please welcome Rabbi Shai Held, President, Dean, and Chair, Hadar Institute.
Good morning, Boker Tov. It is, to put it mildly, a difficult time to be a Jew. It's an excruciating time to be an Israeli, obviously. Agony over the death and devastation wrought by Hamas, rage at the barbaric cruelty and brutality of the terrorists, apprehension and dread about the hostages and their fate, fear and worry for the soldiers, siblings, children, enmeshed in combat deep in Gaza against an enemy devoid of scruples. The sense that the government, the army, and the intelligence services all failed and failed miserably. Doubt that the country's leadership is up to the tasks of the moment. It is a lot to carry. It's different, obviously, but it's an extremely painful time to be a Jew in America too, as we've already heard. We share in the agony and the outrage and the worry and the fear. Many of us find ourselves, both personally and communally, forced to reevaluate who our friends are, both within the Jewish community and beyond it. We are confronted with an explosion of virulent anti-Semitism around the world. Academics who justify and even celebrate Hamas. College students who threaten their Jewish peers with murder and rape. It's all just a lot. We are living in a world that is nothing like the one many of us thought we were living in on October 6th. I want to begin by inviting us again, all of us, to take a moment to do two things. First, to sit with the grief and the fear and the anxiety and the indignation that we all feel. And second, to take in our surroundings. All around are people who share in our anguish. So let's allow ourselves to hurt together, but also, and no less importantly, to take comfort in one another. Let's talk for a moment about the far left. I should say that personally, until October 7th and its aftermath, I myself was more closely aligned with the left than anything else. And on many issues of domestic policy, both here and in Israel, I remain aligned with it. But for me, at least, something fundamental has broken. We know about Christian nationalism and white supremacy on the right. And I want to underscore that they are every bit as appalling and unforgivable today as they were 4 weeks ago. But we also ought to know, after this month of October, we have no excuse not to know about the rampant anti-Semitism in parts of the left. While the attacks in Gaza were still unfolding, a variety of activist groups began celebrating the supposedly, quote, heroic resistance of Hamas. I don't think I will ever unsee the posters of the paragliders. Never mind the murder and beheading of infants. Never mind the savage assaults and rapes. Never mind the murder of entire families at point blank and in cold blood. Never mind the kidnapping of children and of aged Holocaust survivors. Never mind any of that. The occupied, we were told, have the right to resist by any means necessary. The rhetoric of decolonization was invoked to justify the dehumanization of Israelis and within just a few moments of Jews around the world. In the most extreme cases, even Israeli children were labeled occupiers and hence deemed fair game. The moral rot is staggering. The campus left's embrace of Hamas would be funny were it not so utterly obscene. It is simply actually unfathomable to me that I even have to say a sentence like that in this day and age. As the social theorist Susie Linfield put it in 2019, this is a quote, "In the left's keen focus on anti-imperialism and its animus to Israel, it twisted itself into supporting some of the world's most sadistic modes of terrorism and most fearsomely repressive regimes. Regimes that many leftists had little interest in, except as symbols of anti-Zionist, quote, resistance." At the risk of belaboring the point, let's talk for a moment about two issues that leftists claim to, and most of the time seemingly actually do, care about tremendously: women's rights and LGBTQ rights. First, women's rights. Beverly Milton Edwards of the Queen's University in Belfast, one of the world's leading experts on Hamas, reports that beginning in 1987, quote, "Gangs of Hamas enforcers in Gaza stormed into classrooms demanding that bareheaded girls put on the hijab." Milton Edwards quotes Naima al-Sheikh Ali, the director of the Fatah women's section in Gaza. Quote, she says, "Before 1987, when Hamas rose to power, everything was normal. It was a personal freedom not to wear the hijab. But after that, Hamas began imposing its agenda. Whenever they saw a woman without a veil, they attacked her, and sometimes they threw acid in her face." Milton Edwards and others report that honor killings, including those allegedly carried out by and sanctioned by Hamas, are, quote, "by no means rare." During the first Intifada, Hamas strenuously advocated forcing women out of the public sphere and back into their homes. It urged that girls as young as 13 should be married, both because this would supposedly protect them from the male gaze, and because they would start producing more fighters at a younger age. To this day, according to an Israeli government report, 29% of women in Gaza were married before the age of 18, and 13.4% before the age of 15. There is currently no law in Gaza prohibiting violence against women within the family or home, including sexual violence. Speaking to Milton Edwards, Hanan Ashrawi puts it rather understatedly, quote, "Hamas will never accept that women are equal. The question of equality is out of their agenda." And what about gay rights? Sexual activity between men in Gaza is illegal. The penalty for men who engage in sexual activity with one another is up to 10 years in prison. According to the New York Times, in February 2016, Hamas tortured and executed Mahmoud Ishtiwi, one of its own commanders, for what it called moral turpitude, meaning having engaged in gay sex. And in an irony totally lost on people who hold up signs that say "Gays for Gaza," or who merge the gay pride flag with the Palestinian one, the website globalgays.com reports that gay Palestinians often seek refuge in Israel when they fear for their lives, especially when they fear death from members of their own families. That's not pinkwashing, that's just the truth. The point should be clear, and it is clear to anyone with even the barest bit of knowledge about Hamas. The idea that the desire for, quote, "freedom for Palestine" means supporting Hamas is as repugnant as it is absurd. You don't support freedom by venerating those who despise and systematically suppress it. We have heard a great many intellectuals arguing that Hamas is simply resisting Israeli occupation by making use of whatever means are available to it. There is something perverse about both parts of this. Both the claim that Hamas is resisting Israeli occupation and that it is simply doing what desperate people do. First, Hamas has never made a secret of the fact that the occupation it wants to end began not in 1967, but in 1948. Right-wing Israeli politicians are wrong when they say that all Palestinians are committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. But they are not wrong when they say that about Hamas. Hamas leaders themselves will tell you that. They say it all the time. Many on the left, far more, I think, than many of us previously thought or were willing to admit, undoubtedly agree with that and believe that Israel has no right to exist, whatever it means for an established state to have a right to exist. Force them to come out and say that. And if they do not actively oppose all nationalisms, demand that they explain why Jews alone should be refused the dignity of self-determination. And again, ask them why they never protest Hamas's own systematic and relentless abuse of Palestinian human rights. If you only care about Palestinians when they are abused by Israel, then you do not care about Palestinians, you only care about demonizing Israel. Second, there is a tremendous amount of implicit anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian bigotry in claims that the occupation drives people to do horrific things. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto never attempted to slaughter the babies of their tormentors. Many oppressed groups resist their occupiers without parading around with women they have just assaulted and humiliated. Rarely have we seen a greater display of the soft bigotry of low expectations than in the way many pundits, intellectuals, and so-called experts have responded to Hamas's barbarity. It is a disgusting shame. But why? Why? Let's leave aside for a moment the out-and-out anti-Semites. What makes people who see themselves as good guys on the side of dignity and decency and human rights refuse to condemn and at times seemingly even embrace a movement like Hamas? One reason, I think, is that people resist ambiguity. In some place in your life, I'm sure that's true about all of us. They love morality tales. It is much easier to live in a world in which one side is good and the other evil, in which one side is powerful and bad and the other is powerless and weak, in which one side are evil colonialists and the other indigenous victims, than it is to embrace complexity. The fact is that in the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, there have been and are heroes and villains on both sides. No amount of posturing and preening can change that. If you stubbornly insist on reducing every conflict to the colonizer and the colonized, you end up saying nothing useful about real-world problems that require nuanced thinking and analysis. I've also been struck, I have to say, by another dimension of resisting ambiguity, and this is really difficult and hard. To read many journalists, pundits, and college students, including, I should say, many Jewish ones, is to get the impression that any army that kills any civilian has committed a war crime. Intention is irrelevant. Murdering an infant in cold blood is equivalent to accidentally killing an infant when hunting a terrorist. Just war theory, with all its limits, is about living in a world that is morally ambiguous. A world in which one is sometimes faced with only bad choices and worse ones. Listening to and reading many of the folks on the far left, I've been tempted to excoriate them for what I think of as their moral and intellectual laziness. But under that laziness lies something many of us can actually relate to. A fear of encountering the world as fundamentally tragic, a world in which there are actually no good choices. Now, let me emphasize, lest I be misunderstood, the fact that Israel is fighting a just war does not free it from following the laws of war. Jus ad bellum, the justice of war, and jus in bello, the conduct of war, are decidedly not the same thing. Quite the contrary, in fact. The laws of war are meant to guide and constrain the conduct of nations at war, even just and necessary war. But the language of war crimes cannot be tossed around promiscuously. Actually, it can and is tossed around promiscuously, but it shouldn't be. It cannot be used to describe every death we regard as horrific and tragic. And the death of civilians in war is undoubtedly both horrific and tragic. In the context of war, I fear, those who merely condemn, quote, all killing are dooming themselves to irrelevance. I want to be clear. Some criticism of Israel is appropriate, and that is no less true now than ever. Spirited debate, even and perhaps especially in difficult times, is a hallmark of Jewish life, as it should be. To be sure, there are some Jews who effectively deny Israel, and only Israel, it would seem, the right to defend itself and its citizens. But not every criticism of Israel is a betrayal of Israel or a negation of Zionism. We weaken our community if and when we suggest otherwise. I want to focus for a moment on something else, something I see from well-meaning people on the left, both Jewish and non. And that is a stubborn and insistent refusal to know, let alone reckon with, what radical Islam really is, to reckon with how utterly murderous and genocidal it is. There are many reasons for this refusal. Some of it, no doubt, stems from liberal fantasies about how we all want the same things ultimately, to put food on the table, give our kids a better future than we've had, etc. Some of it, I think, has to do with people's secularity and their attendant inability to imagine that murderers in the name of God really believe what they believe and intend what they intend. This has always been a terrible mistake. Some of it stems, as I've already suggested, from incredibly simplistic, obscenely simplistic narratives about how white colonizers are always unambiguously evil and victims of color, quote unquote, are always victims. And some of it, I think, stems from an understandable recoiling from how some have painted all Muslims as radical Muslims, to the point where a president of the United States instituted a Muslim ban. But we should be clear, if Islamophobia, or more accurately, hatred of Muslims is real, so too is radical Islam. And if we don't want to talk about it the way right-wing extremists talk about it, the answer is not to avoid talking about it all, but rather talking about it better. And certainly not to label as racist or Islamophobic anyone who dares. The temptation to ignore or forget what radical Islam really is seems to have ensnared many Israeli leaders too. They honestly came to believe that Hamas's leadership would be content with building their own theocratic statelet in Gaza. And now, horrifically, they and we all know better. And more than that, there is Benjamin Netanyahu's staggering cynicism. The strategy of weakening the Palestinian Authority and bolstering Hamas so that you can say, see, there is no partner for peace among the Palestinians and avoid territorial concessions, well, this, just like everything else about Netanyahu's government did, has turned into cataclysm and disaster. Liga Acheret. As I've started ending my emails to Israeli friends, Liga Acheret indeed. Nothing, but nothing, justifies supporting Hamas. I can't believe that that's something one actually has to say, so I'll say it again. Nothing, but nothing, justifies supporting Hamas. But in trying to understand Hamas's popularity, two things are worth keeping in mind, whether we like it or not. And if I alienated some of you with the first part of what I said, the rest of you are now welcome aboard my train. First, as Milton Edwards and countless others have reported, Much of Hamas's support stems not from its terrorism and barbarity, but from the social services, food for the poor, schooling for children, etc., that they provide. By the way, to state the obvious, the fact that the Palestinian Authority in Gaza was so hopelessly corrupt, the fact that so many of its leaders line their own pockets while leaving their people to go hungry, only served to elevate many Gazans' view of Hamas. And to state something else that should also be obvious, some of Hamas's leaders have turned out to be no better, leaving the people they claim to care about to live in abject poverty while they live luxuriously in hotels I personally could never afford. Before making my second point, let me say again, nothing justifies supporting Hamas. That said, we have to confront the fact that immiserating poverty and humiliating occupation radicalize people. It is hard and it may be impossible to de-radicalize people who live without hope. And that brings me to another point, one that honestly terrifies and overwhelms me. I feel like that all of us who are kind of intellectual leaders are or ought to be paralyzed by this problem. On some level, Hamas is not just a movement, it's a set of ideas, or if you prefer, an ideology. And you simply cannot defeat an ideology using tanks and warplanes. You can kill the leadership, and you can weaken or destroy its ability to do evil. But an ideology is so much harder to defeat. Which is to say that although I have heard many people on the right, and especially on the far right, claim that what happened showed they were right all along, this seems to me to be patently false. The idea that you can subject a people with national aspirations to indefinite occupation is a fantasy, and an immoral fantasy at that. The truth about occupation is that it devastates the occupied and rots the soul of the occupier. That is not... I am sorry to have to say that, but that is not less true now than it was a month ago, even if the possibility of a real solution currently seems further away than ever before. Let's talk for a moment about anger and indignation. On one level, of course, indignation is appropriate here. How could we not feel that? And at the same time, though, there's a tremendous danger of anger, even righteous anger, even fully justified anger. And that is that it can prevent us from seeing straight, can lead us to say dumb and deeply dangerous things and to make very bad, reckless choices. I hear people say things that are completely irresponsible. Obliterate Gaza, they say. After all, quote, this was all over my Facebook feed for several weeks, the Palestinians voted Hamas into power. Well, yes, but that was 17 years ago. More than half of the present population of Gaza was not even born when that election took place. It's also worth remembering that Hamas did not win a majority of votes even in that election. 45% support is 45% too much. But, quote, they all support Hamas is just not true. Or, I've heard people say, quote, but the people of Gaza should have protested and overthrown Hamas. So I want to be honest here, because part of me feels exactly that, and part of me finds myself wondering in recent days, were I faced with a murderous regime likely to kill me and or my family if I speak out, would I do so? I hope so, obviously, but I can't honestly say that I'm sure. And that means that at least a little humility on this front is in order. Some say Hamas is Amalek. I understand the impulse and the urge to turn to tradition to help us process what the Jewish people endured on October 7th. I share that impulse. Turning to tradition to help us process and think through our lives is what I do for a living all day long. I also sympathize with the search to find language to help us express just how evil and depraved Hamas really is. And there really does seem to be no bottom. But please, please, resist the temptation to invoke Amalek at this moment. Taken literally, The biblical commandment to wipe out Amalek is a mandate for genocide. This is horrifying and terrifying. And by the way, real genocide, not the gaslighting genocide that we hear so much about. This is horrifying and terrifying, which I assume is why Chazal, our sages, worked so hard to neutralize it. They insisted that we today cannot know who is of the seed of Amalek, etc. Please don't bring what Chazal put to bed back to life. Unconscionably, there are members of the Israeli government who would think nothing of committing evil in God's name. Please don't hand matches to pyromaniacs. More than that, invoking Amalek makes it tempting to elide the difference between Hamas and the Palestinians as a whole. This is as unforgivable as it is dangerous. I also understand the defense that says, but Amalek is an idea. Yes, for some modern Jewish thinkers it is, but it is still extremely dangerous. In Jewish tradition, Amalek is not just a metaphor for evil. It is far more dangerous and potentially far more murderous than that. Please stop. I have talked a lot about pain and anxiety and worry. But I also want to note that in recent weeks, we have experienced something that we ought to meet with wonder and even simple astonishment. We have seen Israelis come together to support one another in ways that are simply extraordinary. Hamas likely saw the deep and acrimonious divides in Israeli society and concluded that Israel was vulnerable in ways it had never been before, and there may even have been some truth to that. But Hamas badly underestimated the profound solidarity that most Israelis still feel with one another, even amidst these social divisions. And it totally underestimated the resilience of the Jewish people and the Israeli people. And it will pay dearly for that miscalculation. But it is not only Israelis. Jews around the world have rallied to defend Israel and support it and to care for each other, to donate in unprecedented sums, and to help Israel endure and survive this horrible moment. Amidst all of our sorrow and our pain, I think the Jewish community has a lot to be proud of. Zionism is not dead. The state of Israel will recover, even if the very real wounds of October 7th and its aftermath never quite heal. I will say only two things about the reboot of Zionism that seems to me to be urgently necessary. First, Israelis will have to come together to repair and reweave the social fabric that holds them together. Social solidarity during times of crisis is critical. But social solidarity during more regular quotidian times is no less so, and is arguably even more so. Israel will have to ask itself what kind of society it wants to be, and, I hasten to add, with what kind of leaders. It will have to ask hard questions about extreme inequality and the anger and disillusion that come with it. Second, Israelis will have to realize something that some refuse to. Israel cannot occupy the Palestinians forever. It cannot do so both because of the legitimate needs of the Palestinian people and because of what a permanent occupation has done and will continue to do to those forced to enforce it. Specifically, and I find this hard to say because at an earlier point in my life, I was training to become a historian of religious Zionism. Specifically, Israel will need to have an accounting of its far right, and especially its religious far right. And I want to be clear, I say this specifically as a religious person for whom Torah is everything. The racism that runs so deep in many quarters, the refusal to see or affirm the humanity of Palestinians, the unabashed militarism, the valorization of violence among Noar Hagvaot, the hilltop youth, and their enablers. All of this needs to be confronted and repaired. Unconscionably, since October 7th, extremist settlers have unleashed a relentless wave of violence and in some cases out-and-out murder against Palestinians who are just going about their day. They have chased entire Palestinian communities from their homes, and they have paid no price at all. It is long past time for the Israeli government to bring this insanity to an end. It is morally abhorrent and religiously repugnant, and it totally sullies and compromises Israel's cause. And it also has the potential, obviously, to cause the West Bank to completely explode, which is the last thing anyone sane should want. It would be an egregious mistake to conflate the larger religious Zionist world with the extremists in its midst. And yet it is crucial to emphasize, if ever there was a time when moderate religious Zionists have to speak up and make their voices heard, it is now, when the pyromaniacs are working hard to start a massive fire in the West Bank. In my estimation, at least, there are at least three keys to stopping all this, some in the immediate term and some in the longer. First, arrest those who attack Palestinians. Punish them. Treat them like the terrorists that they are. Second, work to establish datiyut acheret, another very different way of being religious. Shut down institutions, mechinot and yeshivot, that educate for radicalism and that instigate violence. Shut them down. And no less importantly, build alternatives, restore humanistic values and an unflagging commitment to universal human dignity to the center of religious education. And three, elect leaders who clamp down on the behavior of these settlers and who do not, implicitly or explicitly, share their agenda of driving Palestinians from their homes. Our sages warn that Torah can be a double-edged sword. Zacha naset lo sam chayim, lo zacha naset lo sam mavet. If we merit and are worthy, the sages promise, Torah can become a healing potion, an elixir of life. But if we do not merit and are unworthy, they warn, Torah can become a deadly poison. When it comes to dealing with our own violent extremists, the future of Israel, and to no small degree the future of Torah itself, are on the line. Judaism can be a source of love and care and goodness and decency and a commitment to justice. It can and must be rescued from those committed to doing evil in its name. Finally, aren't you glad to hear me say finally? You know, I'm a rabbi by training, which means I only get to say in conclusion 3 times. So in conclusion, number 1, I am not optimistic about the future of Israel, but I am hopeful. One could argue that there are good reasons to despair, but Jewish thinkers tell us that despair is not a luxury we are permitted. Rak lo lehityaesh. Despite the darkness that threatens to envelop us in moments like these, we must not give up and give in to despair. It is okay to be pessimistic. There is no virtue in being an optimist. Optimism is just a matter of temperament. But hope is something different from optimism. Hope is something we seek to embody. It's commitment to making something different happen in the world, even when we're not totally confident that we can. For this reason, the British writer Terry Eagleton explains, hope and temperamental optimism are at daggers drawn. I love that formulation. Hope and temperamental optimism are at daggers drawn. You do not have to be an optimist, but as a Jew, you do have to cultivate hope. Let me put this differently, again borrowing from Eagleton. Optimism, he says, is a form of psychological disavowal, a moral evasion. It does not take despair seriously enough. And as such, he says, optimism is, quote, the enemy of hope, which is necessary precisely because one is able to confess how grave a situation is. Israel's situation right now is grave, and it may very well be that the situation of American Jews is in some crucial senses grave too. So what is hope? It is, in the philosopher Paul Ricoeur's wonderful phrase, a passion for the possible. A passion for the possible. It is, Eagleton explains, a movement towards the good rather than a mere craving for it. We can act. We can reach out to our people in Israel and let them know that they are loved by us and front of mind for us. We can lobby public officials and ensure that the hostages are not forgotten. We can tell the truth about Hamas. We can support Israelis on the front lines as well as first responders and therapists and trauma centers. We can commit to helping build a better, more humane, more thoroughly democratic Israel. We can work without naivete or wishful thinking for a brighter future for both peoples who are so fiercely attached to the same glorious, impossibly tortured piece of land. We are Jews, and so we must hope. But please remember, genuine hope involves commitment. Genuine hope involves commitment. May we soon be blessed with better days. Thank you all so much.